Tina Ruggieri. I am the assistant curator at the Abrams Engel Institute for the Visual Arts, located at the University of Alabama at Birmingham's campus. I'm excited to be here today with artist Austyn Weiner. Austyn was born in 1989 in Miami, Florida. She studied photography at the University of Michigan School of Art and Design in Ann Arbor and Parsons School of Photography in New York. Subjects of romance, rejection, and isolation are evident in Austyn's work. She is a multimedia artist whose practice denotes and engages a recourse in chaos. Austyn has worked as a commercial photographer, specializing in photojournalism for backstage fashion shows. Her interest in fashion continued by working with a French clothing brand, Each Other, to design her own collection. She has been included in solo and group exhibitions at galleries such as the Journal Gallery in New York, Bill Brady Gallery in Miami, and iBid Gallery in West Hollywood. She has even curated exhibitions such as We the People in 2016 to raise funds for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Austyn, thank you so much for joining me today. First,
thank you. How nice to meet you.
It's really nice to officially meet you, even if it is virtually. It's so fun. These have been a lot of fun. So I want to just first ask you, how have you been doing during these challenging times and during quarantine?
It's been a roller coaster, and I think I, along with many others, have experienced that. I sort of now being on hopefully the back end, at least of this phase of quarantine, I definitely feel like it has been broken up into phases. The first few weeks I was sort of frozen and debilitated, and I've been quarantined alone. So I definitely felt myself FaceTiming and on the phone a lot and trying to connect and feel a little bit of togetherness and sort of grasping and holding on to that. At a certain point, I definitely let go a little and turned more to my work, which has very much gotten me through this. Mm-hmm. And, every day is different. And I'm definitely have been very aware of just how important mental health is right now. And so being easier on myself than usual has really helped me to get through this time a little bit gentler than maybe I usually am on myself. But I would say, yeah, exactly. Trying to be kind. If I want to eat the bagel, I'm going to eat the bagel. If I want to paint, I'm going to paint. And on days I didn't want to paint, whereas in the normal world, I maybe would have forced that upon myself. I've really let myself be very fluid in this period of time and feeling my way through instead of trying to think my way through. And that's been helpful.
Yeah, I understand that. And I feel like a lot of us have taken that approach, especially being those who are isolated by themselves. So as we all know, artists, museums, galleries have been working diligently to keep people engaged in the art world during this time. You have gone as far as mounting your own exhibition titled Head, which is in your studio or / garage, which you've titled Soul Car Garage. And you are in Los Angeles. Can you tell us how this exhibition came about?
Yeah, so my studio is in downtown Los Angeles. And when the quarantine began, I instinctually knew that I would not want to be driving back and forth to my studio. And I had a garage under my apartment that I never used. It was just filled with old boxes. And I very instinctually came home on the first week of quarantine and began kind of furiously cleaning out this garage. And lo and behold, it started with me just painting in one little corner of the garage with still all of my boxes around. And then slowly I started throwing things away and emptying it and bringing more and more canvases from the studio. And I think that for me, I sort of took a moment to I knew that instinctually I would need to be painting, but I also didn't really want to put so much pressure on myself. So I ended up, without it being very premeditated, creating this little studio for myself under my apartment.
Mhm.
And it I really cleaned it up by the end of it, but throughout the whole quarantine, I mean, it's been an absolute mess. And I think some, as studios are, and I think something that's really affected the work that's been created in here is, in general, the process it takes for me to start a work and finish a work. I don't really expose the underpaintings.
Mhm.
I seldom show in process or unfinished works. And because the garage opens to the street and everybody has been, walking, that's been basically all everyone's been doing, period, is on these long walks. I've been forced to expose that and to really show the process of making the works. And so it sort of broke through this barrier for me of this vulnerability and this almost shyness that existed in my process,
Mhm.
and kind of forced me to expose it all. Um, I created the work on the back wall that you can see in that picture right there. That was the first work created in here, and I honestly didn't really think much of the painting um, at all. There was something comforting to me about it. It was a face. It was flowers. It brought in a lot of the light that was sort of on one end of this dark garage. And
Mhm.
I think I found comfort in the painting, but I didn't necessarily think about it as anything, as the beginnings of anything, or as anything that I would possibly exhibit or try to, continue on in here. And one night there's four works in the garage, and one night I came down here sort of late at night, and I only have one small light in here. So it's not like I have a ton of light source. So I pretty much was only painting during the day. And I flipped a canvas that was lying here horizontally, and I began painting a second one, and
Mhm.
sort of going off of this idea of a container and the head as a container, and the idea of the self portrait being my own head,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. And that work sort of came like surging out of me. um, and once I had those two heads next to each other, it sort of dawned on me that these were not only very much self portraits, but that I was really reflecting on this idea of isolation sort of subconsciously. And I tend to paint a reflection of what I'm experiencing in my own life, but I don't always know at the moment that I'm doing it why I'm doing it. And so once I looked at both of them together and started to see the array of emotion, I realized I was sort of painting the stages of my quarantine. And so next came so then those two paintings were almost painted in a pair. Um, the first one that's on that back wall was merely an underpainting. The charcoal, which is a big component of my work,
Mhm.
and oftentimes happens in very kind of aggressive and almost like violent mark making.
Yeah.
The yellow painting, which is titled "The Strand Is Mine," that painting, the name came from a a little sort of excerpt I wrote while I was painting it that said, "You dangle your validation above my head like a strand of gold, but the strand is mine."
Mhm.
And that sort of came from this idea. Well, it's twofold. I think is young artists, or artists in general, we really do struggle, even the most confident of artists, we struggle with this idea of validation
Yeah.
and of needing the approval of others, while truly being addicted to this idea of freedom and the romanticism of being strong enough to follow our own path. And so that I started kind of alluding to an experience with someone in my life where I felt like they were always sort of dangling their validation on top of my head like a bargaining chip. And then sort of separate to that, I have very thick blonde hair,
Yeah.
and no, you could give me a hug for really like 10 minutes. I mean, 10 seconds. And a strand of my hair will very oftentimes be found on your sweater or in your car somehow. And so it's this funny thing where it sort of is another form of my mark making. I
Yeah.
tend to always leave strands of my hair places.
Hilarious.
And so this painting was really a very sort of, it was created in a volatile moment of frustration and confusion within the quarantine, and I sort of stepped and looked back at it, and I just saw myself, and I saw a real moment of a real honest self portrait. And so it dawned on me, especially in conjunction with the other one,
Yeah.
that I was going to allow myself to not try to make the same painting over and over again,
Yeah.
but to really take a moment to express the range of emotions that I was and have been experiencing through this period of time.
So
And yeah.
I was going to ask, so you were talking about, not only younger artists, but a lot of artists make work and kind of seek validation. Do you think that with these works, you were seeking maybe either validation from yourself or just completely carefree and working through what you've been going through in quarantine?
Well, I think what's really interesting about these works and creating in this space is I truly had no intention of showing them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I had come to terms with the fact that, like a lot of creatives right now, I might just walk out of quarantine having made or attempted to make a couple paintings that I maybe would have been mediocrely okay with, or
Yeah.
maybe not at all, and that no one might see them. And so, within that, I think that I was sort of in a moment of freedom because
Mm-hmm.
the pressure was off. And then at the same time, I think I was really in the ring with myself.
Yeah.
And I think that I was in combat with myself really kind of throughout this whole quarantine, because it's just been me and me.
Yeah.
And so that already sort of thematically is a big part of my work.
Yeah.
And so I think it's been sort of this perfect storm. And part of that was because there's been zero expectation.
Mm-hmm. And that's very freeing, just to be able to make work without expectation of knowing that you have a solo show coming up or a group show coming up or a thematic show, and you're just making work truly for the sake of making work in a way.
Absolutely. And I think, the romanticism of the other side, kind of that duality exists in everything. And, grass is always greener. I
Yeah.
remember the days where I was just got to Los Angeles and was painting after painting, and I dreamed of the day that I was painting toward a goal, and I dreamed of the day that I had shows lined up, and now where I've had a few group shows and solo shows, and it's been a great few years for me within my process and my work. I've romanticized about a time where I was painted uninhibitedly again.
Yeah.
And this quarantine has given me that time. And so I think that I really had this just a very light and kind of beautiful energy surrounding me, which allowed me to sort of paint like no one was watching, so to speak.
So my next question is just, how do you feel? Do you feel that this show was successful, and how did you work out with the social distancing, having people come into your space to actually view the works?
So by my, all I'm thinking, as everyone is, I'm thinking so much about so many different things, and viewing systems and existing ways of doing things before this all happened, and questioning those things. And for my definition of success, which potentially has been a bit altered since this all has happened in a beautiful and kind of honest way, I feel it was so successful.
Mm-hmm.
It just felt so good to play all of the parts. You know, I painted the show. I prepared. Once the paintings were painted, I sort of had made the decision that I was gonna transform this space. I painted the walls and you know, prepared it as much as I could. And after that point, I also was the gallerist, and I was also the artist sitting in here, and I sort of allowed myself to really, it ended up being somewhat performative.
Yeah.
But in a way that was so raw and honest, which also is of the utmost importance to me. So I really do feel that in a moment that everything's been so uncertain, this
Yeah.
has actually felt so right.
Yeah.
And that's been a beautiful feeling. And honestly, like the littlest things, you know, deadlines, for instance, and all these things that artists always have anxiety about, I was answering to myself,
Yeah.
which kind of also is part of the performance of playing all these roles. And that's been really so enjoyable for me, and the experience of, so in terms of the social distancing,
Yeah.
I allotted about 12 days to keep the show open. About within those 2 weeks, I had about 8 days that were allotted for random people on that I didn't know personally to sign up via an app on our phones that I had come across called Calendly, actually. And I decided to schedule the appointments every hour on the hour so that there was room in between each person. Something beautiful about the gallery, you know, about viewing art, is you really don't need to touch anything. At least you're not, you know, at least you're not supposed to. So that, and also the nature of the garage, it's sort of air flowing and it has so much openness to it to begin with, that I was able to see almost 70 people in here.
Wow.
I just, yeah, which is so amazing. And I told, you know, I made sure that everyone came in with a mask. I made sure I have a sign in book that I wanted to sort of commemorate this with. And I made sure people brought their own pens. And you know, the experience, and for so many people, I was the first person that they had seen since the real kind of absolute mandated lockdown, and I was absolutely the first art experience.
Yeah.
So I think that in general is that was really, people were so, it just felt like art for art's sake again.
Yeah.
And all of the complexities and complications and vulnerability that comes with being a young artist trying to navigate this big bad art world sort of all has fallen to the wayside within this experience. And I just had people coming here so genuinely excited and moved about the opportunity to see paintings in person.
Yeah.
And for me, I can't even tell you, I mean, this has by far and away been the most rewarding thing I've ever done in terms of my heart, honestly. And
It also
just,
seems maybe more vulnerable than a show in a gallery, that you're not there 24/7. You're not there watching. I mean, of course you're there at openings and things like that, but you are there to experience the art hand in hand with the visitors that came to Soul Car Garage. And that's
absolutely. And out of those, you know, let's say 70 people that came, I sat on this table at the front of the garage the entire time. Nobody watched the garage for me. There was no one else in this space but me. And I could mount 1,000 shows and I would never have the opportunity to sit in the space. I mean, actually, who knows what this brings on now?
I know.
I might, you know, it really might spark a whole bunch of other kind of
How
ideas.
It's like, how many more shows are you going to do, Austyn?
I don't know, but I do know that I had an opportunity to connect with people in a time when no one has had any
Yeah.
visceral connectivity whatsoever. And there was such a beautiful and honest and equal exchange between me and whoever was standing in this garage that I got more out of it than I feel like even the people who came to see. And for somebody who's been quarantined alone, that has been immeasurable to not only have people in this space experiencing sort of the world in which I've been experiencing for the last 10 weeks, but also to share in art.
Yeah. And that's ultimately what art is about. It's about bringing people. And one of my favorite things to tell people about what I love about art is that it doesn't matter what your background is, what your age is, or your age differences. Art is your immediate connection with someone else, you know, and you can talk about it with them and you can engage with whoever you're with. And that's the great thing about art. One thing,
Absolutely, and I think especially right now with viewing rooms and the art world trying to navigate sort of how to take next steps and how to deal with this. I think just the return to the importance of the artist and the art making process is what will get us through this period of time.
definitely. I know you've already touched on that you see all of these paintings as a bit of a self-portrait, and I guess, can you talk a little bit about your titles to your works? Because I've noticed just even in past works, your titles are very, in a way, poetic, but also very matter of fact. And how does that relate to you, or how do you come about titling your work?
Writing is a very big part of my process. It comes in many ways much more naturally to me than anything visual does. I feel like the narrative with myself and inside my own mind has been developing longer than any medium I found. So for me, naming the works, of course, everybody gets stumped sometimes, but naming the works sometimes come very, in a moment. With these specifically, I didn't think about it until really the night before I did the first launch of the show, and I came down here. I sat in here. I sat with my journal. I looked at the postcards I had been writing and drawing throughout the quarantine as well, and I sort of was able to match memory with text and remember some experiences of making certain works are so kind of memorable in positive and negative ways that it comes so easily to me. And then other times I have to really kind of dig into what it actually was about and sort of have a moment of honesty with myself. So this work, for instance, An Empty Invitation, in the beginning of the quarantine, I had a emotional closeness with a male figure in my life who I felt like we were sort of doing this song and dance. And once quarantine hit, for people who also found themselves single within the quarantine, it's been an interesting song and dance. And it's been a interesting moment to navigate, an important one, I think. And I started sort of taking a look at my invitations, kind of metaphorically and spiritually, and seeing who really was inviting me in to be a part of this experience with them, even from afar, and who really wasn't. And I sort of had to have an honest moment with myself and let go of, momentarily for this time being, let go of someone that I was sort of crutching on And I just realized that it really was an empty invitation, almost a shallow invitation that I hoped later could change, but that in this moment, that's sort of what it was. And so, and it also was the first painting made, and the time period in which that happened was pretty instantaneous.
That's wonderful. Like wonderful insight, because how else would we know that, you know?
Totally.
And
And that's also what was cool is the people in the garage. I really had a chance to kind of sit and talk it out with them.
yeah, because a lot of the time, you know, a lot of artists don't really like to title their works anymore because people try to read too much into it or try to analyze it too much. But really, there is, with these types of works, all your work seems very personal from the outside, honestly. Anytime, just from the gesture making to the titles. You have language, like in this one here, you can see in the underpainting that there's words written underneath and then you go over it, which adds another layer of intimacy. Because then when you get up close, I don't know what it says, but you may have to show me. So there's, you know, these are all, but the colors that you choose are jarring. The gestures you making can be jarring. But then for the example, this one seems a little bit more harmonious and peaceful, but maybe that's just me reading in something that I want to see in it. That's why art is subjective.
Totally. And I love that. And even the type of work I make, I think, is in part you play as much of a role as I do.
Mm-hmm.
And these works specifically, which is what I'm so excited about kind of continuing on in this series, is that it's my head, it's my container, it's also your head and your container. And the relatability of that, I think, is evident because, especially in quarantine, it really has been a vessel.
Yeah.
And there's been a level of control that has been possible to exercise, and then a level of letting go that's also been necessary in order to survive. And that last painting that you mentioned, An Enigma and a Dream, that painting from a technical standpoint is the first painting that I've been able to render in detail without charcoal, which has been a medium in which I am sort of addicted to at the moment. And I think that's a really exciting painting for me for those reasons. And then also there is a lightness to it. That was the third painting made where I finally reached the place of I'm actually very clear-headed and really quite happy in this state of solitude, and now I almost don't want it to end.
Yeah. And I have to maybe echo that a little bit. In the beginning, I went through my own, like, I can't do this, and I'm not even in isolation alone. I'm with my partner and my 4 dogs. But now I've actually been connecting with more artists and more people from all over the country that I wouldn't normally be able to connect with, because we all are just sitting at home waiting for things to open back up. And so there's this almost like blissfulness to it. Kind of odd to say in a way, but it's there, you know.
It is there, and it's like, you know, the headlines today where death toll reaches close to 100,000.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, in order to survive this period of time, we have no choice but to acclimate. And with that acclimation, if you're lucky, has come the luxury of time.
Yeah.
And I think connecting with artists, me having a moment to paint like no one's watching, like, these are all things that in the end are almost survival instincts, and there it can be an absolute beauty within this absolute chaos.
So I wanted to ask you another question. So when I look at your works, I see really incredible references to artists like Francis Bacon and Andrew Guinea. I mean, even a little bit of Louise Bourgeois and Picasso. Where do you take some of your influences, and how did you become interested in abstraction?
So you definitely named some of them, and I'm honored, by the way, extremely honored. Well, in terms of Bacon, psychology is a big has a big seat at the table in my world. Painting included, before I ever connected it to what I do, that just has always been like me sitting and talking to people all day. That comes more naturally even than anything else, and sort of that intertwines into the writing, and Bacon's work has so much of that in it.
Yeah.
And I think it's not that I've gotten better at painting. I just think I've learned to connect more to myself and know myself more. And a lot of the artists that my concern, I think, one, I never took formal painting courses ever, more or less. So maybe one. So for me, the freedom, you know, you don't know what rules you're breaking if you don't know the rules.
That's true.
So that's been a gift for me personally. I have a big photography background, which led me to Lucas Samaras and some of the artists who have explored that sort of symbiosis between photography and painting. But in general, I never had a desire to render life as it is.
Yeah.
Which would put me in a more, would put me in the interest of realism and all of these things. And I sort of was always very influenced by music and lyricists and the freedom that exists within that fragmented way of putting together poetry with melody and sort of funk and soul and mixing and matching has been such an interest and almost addiction of mine. And Picasso, of course, Bacon, Philip Guston, Jean Dubuffet is a huge influence of mine as well, specifically with the heads. And all these artists are male. And I think that always made me feel a certain way. And I grew up a tomboy, so to speak. And I didn't connect with my femininity in the way I define it until really the last few years of my life. And that was a big struggle for me. I grew up in a home with beautiful women. I have twin sisters that are older than me and a mother, and I never really felt like I fit that mold. And so I think that there's always been this kind of, it's almost as if I'm battling in a way, in this like kind of fun and combative way, the ones that came before me. And like, I want to play with the boys too, you know? And I think that's feels like me on the playground. Like there's such a correlation between like the fourth grader me and then this dialogue of expression too. Tracy Emin, Louise Bourgeois, also both very important to me. Again, both of their work has found its way to a beautiful fusion of narrative and performance and painting and the exploration of all of these mediums. And that's definitely also, I almost think of it as DJing and being able to sort of like scribble within all of these ideas and letting them sort of over time live and breathe in the same space.
So I have one question before I ask you to show us some details of these paintings. So you have a very dynamic and energetic presence, especially on your Instagram and your social media. And and it really even comes through in your paintings. And so, do you see social media as a form of performance art?
I've struggled with social media. It's taken me growing into myself to be comfortable with social media. And it wasn't until this quarantine that I really have realized that it is absolutely a form of performance art.
Yeah.
And we try as artists to do a lot of things. And that's part of the struggle. We attempt to make a painting, and then sometimes it just flies out of us.
Yeah.
And for me, the most genuine things happen out of necessity and not attempt.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning of the quarantine, I sort of, so to speak, broke that third wall and began talking a lot into the camera on Instagram, and it has been incredible. Almost, unfortunately for everyone who follows me, they've almost become my therapists. But again, without the attempt of it, I've been able to sort of tap into this idea of being comfortable with sharing the day-to-day narrative of my life with the ones that quote unquote follow me.
Yeah.
And some days I don't, and some days I do, and I don't let myself be too beholden to that.
Yeah.
But for anybody who might peer out, and we all do this, but anyone who might peer out at me or another artist who they're like, wow, look how confident they are. They can say what they want and do what they want. And there she is just saying it all. Well, it's taken me years and years to even get to the point where I wasn't ashamed with what I felt or had to say. And it's been a beautiful experience throughout this quarantine to sort of unleash that. Yeah. And I am in the midst of compiling kind of all of these morning sessions that I've been, morning wood, as I've been calling it. Compiling these sessions and creating a video work out of it. And again, so much of this has come without the intention of making something. It's just been expressing something.
So what I find really interesting about quarantine for you is that it almost, in a very odd way, has been extremely positive. You've come into your own. You've gotten more confident maybe in yourself. Your painting has even evolved. So in a way, what has been, can be perceived as a negative thing for a lot of people, has actually really helped you. Does that ring true?
It does ring true. In general, I've dealt with, as we all have, I've dealt with an immense amount of pain in my life. I've watched a lot of suffering within my own family, people I love, addiction, all of these things. And my response always to that was to do something positive in order to cancel out the immense negativity. Yeah. And it's my survival mechanism. Yeah. So, in some ways, I'm not surprised that I sort of found a way to cope and express myself during this time. And then on the other hand, I'm like sitting back being like, wow, this is potentially some of the best days of my life.
Yeah.
And it's kind of beautiful. And again, like we were saying, and could feel a little weird about that, but then again, my paintings also reflect that sort of little moment of darkness seeping through, and vice versa. So I'm appreciative within all of this. I am.
Well, I guess our last thing is if you want to maybe show us some details, since we've seen the pictures. And then if there's any last words you want us to know, just, let us know what that is.
Okay. All right. So let's see. let's flip. All right. So, as I sort of said before, this was the first painting.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
and these paintings also were really made over time, and because it was in my under my home,
Mm-hmm.
I would make a mark and then sometimes run away for 5 days, whereas in my studio I am oftentimes like really working it a lot. In this area says that little excerpt I had written earlier, you dangle your validation over my head like a strand of gold, but the strand is mine.
I love the details are truly amazing in your work. It's like each little detail could essentially be its own painting, but it's part of.
Sometimes I wish it was.
uh,
This says this was part of another canvas initially. There was another one hanging horizontally when I wrote this, but it reads "Thank you for the ammo and not a thing more," and that sort of alludes to the ammunition that fired me up in order to make this painting to begin with.
mm,
This work is special because, again, like technically within the painting, and if you look at other bodies of work of mine,
mhm.
the underpainting is a flower work that I painted over.
Yeah.
And so you can still see, and sort of they start to peek through here. You
Mm-hmm.
can see that underpainting and defining certain areas with with void of heavy charcoal has like created a moment of openness, which
Yeah.
I also think is sort of reflective of right now. I managed to creep in the charcoal a little bit.
So, do you think that by not using the charcoal on this one has opened a door for a new series of painting or a different approach to new works?
I do, and I because I'm so interested in sort of the psychological journey, I am very open and into the idea of presenting, a work of this nature next to a work that might feel tighter
Yeah.
and sort of more angsty.
Yeah.
So this painting I have a personal affinity to. It was such a mess until the very end, and it carved itself out just so organically and beautifully. And just considering this was the last one painted and that was the first one, in terms of the technical journey that was taken within these four works,
Yeah.
I'm personally just really excited about this one. And the purpose that the charcoal often is supposed to serve for me is sort of creating windows
Mhm.
of what came before it. And I managed to, block out and leave a lot of different stages of that journey. And so actually this painting, if you look at the neck of this painting,
Yeah.
which is a flower, this painting and this painting were actually one work. And if you look, this orange corner and that orange corner are the same. And those were hanging actually on this wall the whole time together, being painted as one painting.
Oh.
And so it wasn't until the very end that I knew I had to separate them in order to sort of get to the bottom of what they both wanted to be.
Oh, that's interesting. That's fantastic.
So that's sort of exciting because the necks of both of them retained the original painting,
Yeah.
whereas everything else has taken such a journey. This is a personal kind of favorite moment.
It's fantastic. I love seeing the details. I mean, my personal favorite thing, and I tend to post a lot, is our details in paintings. Because you get the texture, you get the language, and like I said, each little moment is important to a painting, even if it is part of a larger whole. These are incredible. Absolutely
Thank you.
incredible. And I
Thank you
want
so much.
to really thank you for taking the time to talk with me and to give us such valuable insight and such a personal experience with your artwork, even though we can't physically be there. But I feel like
it's been a pleasure for me too, and truly anytime. I'm trying to, what I would say that probably the number one thing I've gathered from this time is how sensitive me, and I think a lot of artists can relate to this, are to other energies, other people, being emotionally impressionable, being aesthetically impressionable, and taking a minute, quarantine or not, to sort of isolate yourself and to see what happens when truly standing on your own 2 feet can be such a rewarding experience. And usually the first thought is the right thought. And when I had this idea to do this show, I had the idea, and then I spent another 10 days calling all my friends, doubting myself, saying, no, I can't. These paintings aren't good enough. I shouldn't do this. And the initial thought was the right one. And so
always that gut thought that you have to go with. That gut reaction.
You have to go with your gut.
Exactly.
That's it.
Well, thank you so much. You have been such a delight.
Oh, thank you. And I can't wait to meet in person.
Me too.